Now, we've seen some more information that's been released around this AI diffusion framework, and we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into it. One of the big things that came out that caught my eye was that there were reports that third-party actors were basically evading all of these sanctions by purchasing AI hardware and reshipping it to countries where it was banned. And then we were also seeing that perhaps some of these companies were getting around those restrictions by just renting that AI hardware in the cloud through data centers in countries like Malaysia and Brazil. Well, now the AI Diffusion Framework has named 18 so-called friendly countries that have no restrictions on AI exports. There are an additional 23 countries that are embargoed with either restrictions or caps on the number of AI chips that can be shipped to them. What about the other 150 countries in the world? Well, they're in some kind of a limbo where there are some restrictions, but maybe not others, and they depend on which country you're in, and it's not 100% clear. All of these restrictions are being calculated based on something known as total processing performance, or TPP, which is a metric that judges how powerful a chip is and therefore how likely it is to be restricted for export to one of these so-called tier 2 or tier 3 countries. Now, Stephen, you didn't get a chance to weigh on this last week, but you are one of the experts about AI around here, and we wanted to know, what were your thoughts on this, and can you give us some context around this order as it appears that it is still in effect in the new presidential administration?
Yeah, I've been complaining on the rundown for a year or more about the fact that it looks like there's been quite a lot of folks doing end runs around the administration's efforts to restrict the export of AI. So on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's actually spurred a lot of domestic manufacturing and technology in China that is actually looking pretty darn competitive versus what's happening in the West. Let's take a look at the first part. As you mentioned, we've had these restrictions based on total processing performance as well as performance density of chips for quite a while. But as you mentioned, what's been happening is there's been a lot of reshipping through seemingly friendly countries. There's been a lot of renting through data centers. And frankly, it's been hard to implement these rules. Well, the AI diffusion framework really is a strong response to that. I was actually quite shocked to see how nuanced and how firm this rule is. And I suspect that if the Trump administration is smart, they will continue this framework because, frankly, it looks like a pretty solid 2.0 in terms of restricting access to AI chips. Also, I would point out that the whole reason for this thing to exist is an admission from the US government that effectively whoever controls AI controls the world going forward. That's a pretty serious statement, and I think that it's going to be hard for anyone to doubt that these models are going to be truly transformative in many ways in terms of economic superiority, military superiority, and that sort of thing. So let's look a little bit deeper about how this works. As you mentioned, it effectively divides the world into three segments. We have the tier 1 companies, which are basically countries where the US feels confident that they're going to enforce the same kind of restrictions and controls on AI technology that the US itself would. So in addition to countries that you might expect, like the Five Eyes countries, Canada, England, New Zealand, Australia, this includes many companies in Europe, including France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Republic of Korea, that sort of thing. So these are companies that the United States effectively is saying, you know what, you're good to go. You can have this stuff. You can export it. The tier 3 countries are the ones that are strongly restricted, and that includes China, Russia, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, places like that, where they really don't want these things being exported. The interesting thing, though, is what's happened in the middle, this tier 2. Now, some countries have actually seen their access to AI technology decreased. So, for example, I'm just going to put it out there, Switzerland, is no longer on the friends list for the United States when it comes to AI technology. Same with Israel, Brazil, India. I think that that's going to cause a little bit of friction, and maybe there might be a little shuffling on who's on which list. On the other hand, some countries have seen their access to AI technology upgraded. Countries, for example, including like Yemen. I'm not sure exactly why they should be have more access to AI technology than in the past. The same is true of many of the Arabian Peninsula countries who've seen their access opened up a bit by this ruling. But that's not the whole story. Really, what's happening, the next step here is to have validated end users. In other words, the US really wants to know, where are these chips going? And they're restricting that as well, which I think is actually a really good move because, of course, there's been a lot of rumors that some countries have been basically buying and then reselling these chips to restricted nations. So the validated end users are basically companies like the hyperscalers, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, those sort of folks, and they're able to access this technology and to buy it up. And the ruling would basically force those countries to have their compute located in tier one countries. They can't just buy chips and ship them to other countries, that sort of thing. And in fact, it restricts the amount of compute that they can have in some of these tier two countries, let alone tier three. It also requires American companies to have 50% of their compute power here in the United States, which I think really does upend some things. So what is all this going to mean? Well, first off, I think that it is going to have a chance of actually restricting access to some of this technology that hasn't worked so far. Second off, I think it's going to cause a little bit of disruption in the short term to some of the plans that had been out there for building data centers, for example, in places like Singapore and Brazil, that may not have as much access and may not be as beneficial. It's also going to impact some of the companies that had been serving the global market for AI in locations like that, including a company called Oracle that you may have heard of, that has really built out quite a lot of AI infrastructure outside the United States. We could see some of that stuff being dismantled as a result of these rules. And ultimately, though, I have to return to what I've said on the rundown many times. Ultimately, what's going to happen is the more that they restrict access to this, the more likely it is that China specifically is going to build a homegrown AI infrastructure, and that they're going to continue to invest in chips and in models that are able to compete with the West, because I think they also see that this is really a make or break technology. So there are loopholes still. There are ways that companies can get around this regulation, most notably by buying small orders, many small orders of chips, and then combining them on the other side. That's pretty much unrestricted. And unfortunately, that's probably going to happen. The other thing that caught my eye in this is, if there's a public open weight model that is of a certain size, then building models up to that size are unrestricted, which could be a perverse incentive for a company like China to invest in open weight, open source AI models in order to open up the market for their own AI models. Because effectively, by pushing the state of the art and open models forward, they would be also moving the goal lines for their own closed models. I see where that heads.
Well, I think those are all excellent points, Stephen. And a couple of things that I want to kind of bring up here is, if you remember, that the response to this from companies like NVIDIA was pretty full-throated. And I think that you can see that in the fact that now NVIDIA has to go back and look at all of those pending orders that they had and decide whether or not they can even ship those chips. I mean, obviously, we knew that they had, specific SKUs for companies like China that could only be fulfilled that way. But now, I mean, when you think about the number of data centers that were being built in places like Malaysia, in places like Brazil, that were more primed for infrastructure growth because they maybe did not have some of the demands that we see on the electrical grid, for example. Now you're going to have to go back and figure out if you can even send those things, because they're not tier 3 countries. They're not fully restricted, but they're kind of restricted. So I don't know. I don't envy any of those people by any stretch of the imagination. But I also worry that we're sliding back towards something that anyone who grew up in the late 90s and early 2000s may remember, when you had export restricted versions of Windows. Remember the special super secret 128-bit SSL keys were only available in the US, and you had to, you had to say that you were only going to use those on US systems, and they were export restricted to the axis of evil. You can't send anything more than a 56-bit encryption key to North Korea, for example. We're starting to see that again in that, only companies, or I'm sorry, I did it again, only countries that are friendly to us can do business with companies that have the best of the tools. Well, then you create, like you said, that situation where what happens if the Chinese get a hold of a piece of equipment that they can reverse engineer that's near enough that they can gain 90% of the functionality of the top tier stuff, only now it's locked inside of their ecosystem and they don't need us anymore. Granted, they're still going to be buying chips until they can get their domestic manufacturing processes up in place. But I saw a report today that the iPhone is the third most popular phone in China. And when you consider how popular that phone is in the rest of the world, you're like, well, how could it possibly be that? Because companies have figured out how to take what is important out of those devices, make them domestically, which makes them cheaper, and then provide that as a good enough system. And if you take this into account of some of the things that we saw earlier in that report from the Futurum Group, it kind of makes you wonder if the customers are not clamoring for AI as much as we thought they might have been, or at least they're not asking the companies that are providing it. Does that mean that the market is still developing enough that countries that have found themselves on this list have time to play catch up? Because as you mentioned, tier 2 is weird. Like obviously there are maybe the countries that we're not 100% sold on that they would, back us up in a fight or something like that. And then you have companies like Yemen, who is pretty openly hostile to Western powers like the US. But then you think to yourself, if I was going to build a data center to do a whole bunch of AI processing, would I put it in Sana'a today, or would I put it in Riyadh, or Noam, or wherever? The thing is that I think that some of these country classifications, like you said, are going to be moved. But more importantly, it opens up the opportunity for those countries to work with the government to kind of say, okay, really, we're bros, we can work this out, to kind of get upgraded into that tier where they're not restricted. But I also wonder, does that mean that you're opening yourself up to basically US weapons inspections to ensure that, yes, you ordered these 95 serial numbers of these NVIDIA chips, and we need to know where all of those are in your building and how they're being used and what your customer list is? There may be countries that decide that whether or not they're friendly, they're just not up for that level of scrutiny, because as we've seen over the years, sometimes inspectors find what they're looking for, whether or not it's actually there or not. And I worry that companies that are uncomfortable with having to jump through those hoops may decide to just move around those restrictions completely by, I don't know, moving their headquarters to a place where they're no longer affected by those restrictions. And then that kind of creates this other weird, I don't know, Twilight Zone type situation where companies make one product for the domestic market, they make one product for the export restricted market, and then they make one product in another place that is not subject to any of that they can sell to whomever they want. And that just creates confusion. It creates chaos, and it creates the possibility that those companies could focus their development efforts in areas where they're not restricted. And then you get into the situation of, well, if we spend all this money on the CHIPS Act to make people build stuff here, but then we put restrictions on them so that they can't send that stuff that they made to countries where they can get top dollar for it, why are they going to continue to build factories here? Why don't they just dump them and go somewhere else?